On today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet, I'm going to talk about what I think is the true origin of the term peter out. Have you heard that before? You know, like when someone's speaking and they just trail off and you say, "Oh, well, they started full steam ahead, but they just petered out at the end." Or, if there's a stream that becomes a trickle and then nothing, you say, "Well, that stream petered out." Or sometimes you might even say, it's raining outside, and you say, "Well, it looks like the rain is petering out," meaning it's diminishing or getting less, and then eventually kind of has gotten to the point where it's stopped. So if you try to find the source of the phrase to peter out, you're going to hit a dead end, because there's no agreement on where it actually comes from. But there are some really kind of wild explanations. But I have, to add to the wild explanations for you today, I have what I think is a less wild explanation that very well might explain where it comes from. Plus, we're going to talk about the Peter Principle. And just so this episode doesn't peter out, we're going to end on a high note with a drawing of a card from the Life's Potluck Buffet card deck. I'm John Paulus. Thanks for listening. Let me begin with the Peter Principle. Have you ever heard of this? It's an idea that people in their employment rise to a job title and a position of their highest level of incompetence, rather than, sometimes we kind of think about it the opposite way, where we think, oh, you rise to the highest level of your competence. But the Peter Principle kind of shows, with good reason, that we get promoted until we reach the level where we're no longer competent. And this seems counterintuitive, of course, but actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Now, the reason it's called the Peter Principle is that Lawrence J. Peter, a Canadian man who was quite interesting person in general. I read a little bit about his life and his things that he got up to in life, and a very interesting person. But Lawrence J. Peter and Raymond Hull wrote a book in 1969 called The Peter Principle about this. And it was meant to be a kind of critique of hierarchy. And that was a big thing in Lawrence J. Peter's life, was criticisms of hierarchical structures. And so the idea was that, to show that like these hierarchical structures actually work in a way where our most incompetent selves end up at the top, because, well, that's the way that this kind of promotion works in a hierarchical system, according to Peter and Hull. And their idea is that when you get promoted to a new job, you're not competent at that new job. You get promoted from a job that you were competent at, and then you're in a new job where you have to, learn that job. And, that makes sense with all of our experiences, where you're doing something new, you're learning, you're not at the highest level of competence at that job. And then the idea is that when you get to that highest level of competence, you get promoted to some other job, and that job you're not, you're incompetent at. And then eventually if you keep on getting promoted, you get promoted to the point where you're incompetent at what you do, but you can't achieve the competence that is needed to move you to something else, or the next thing. And therefore that's like your kind of final position, and you're basically promoted to the highest level of incompetence that you can have, right? So that's their whole thing. And it was meant to be a critique, it was meant to be satire, but it turned out that like people kind of started thinking, this is a lot of sense in what the Peter and Hull are talking about here. And so it actually started to become a thing people talked about. And there are very serious things written about it that are how I was just searching online. You could see things like how to avoid the Peter Principle, things like that. And it doesn't seem like there's any avoiding of it, but nonetheless, that is the Peter Principle, and it's something worth thinking about. And we're going to ask the cards about it, and we'll see if we can draw card number 8, which is translation is your enemy, because that's part of this whole Peter Principle thing. Is that you're because skills in one job don't automatically like translate to skills in another job. You can't like kind of carry over that competency. So we'll see if that's the card we draw. That'll be interesting. I'm not. It's not a challenge cards. I'm just saying. Just saying. Okay. And I kind of like how it works pretty well with our expression petering out. Like your the idea is that our competency kind of peters out at the until the very end. That's kind of neat. I like that idea. But but the Peter Principle, as I said, was named after a person, not named after the phrase to peter out. As I said to start, if you look up what the source, what the original kind of source of to peter out is, or where it comes from, you're not going to get a lot of help, but there are little clues here and there. Well, let me talk to you about some of the wild speculation. There was a period in the early 20th century when a lot of people seemed to like to write into local newspapers and talk about where peter out really comes from. And I think that like thinking about those is what helped me kind of figure out where we might look, because those think that in general, that this whole idea that it started as a mining term, which you'll find in most explanations of the origins of it, you'll find that it has to do something with miners using this word for a vein of whatever mineral or ore that is being mined, like when it diminishes to nothing in the rock, then it's petering out. And you actually see this in testimony in court cases. I've looked through some old court cases where there's some copper mining in somewhere in the U.S. where the attorney asks a witness about was this copper petering out, and they keep on talking about petering out, and you see it in mining treatises in quotes sometimes, which makes me think that like it's a term that is not yet in the kind of standard coinage, but one that's commonly used and maybe out in the field there. So I have a feeling it does have to do with mines, although the people who were sending these letters to the editor about peter out in the early 20th century, they reject that soundly, which I don't think they're right, but they reject that soundly and say it had to do with this idea of things like the Peter boat. A Peter boat is a fishing boat in England, for example. On the Thames in London, you have had Peter boats. I don't know if you're in London right now and you know or work on a Peter boat, or if there are Peter boats, let me know. I have a feeling there may not be, except for maybe historical purposes. But there are Peter boats, and also the noun Peterman in English has to do with fishing and fishermen. That's what the Peterman thing is, because Peter in the Christian tradition, the figure Peter was a fisherman. And so the name got associated with fishing. And so that's why you have Peterman as a fisherman or Peter boat, etc. But the people who write these letters to the editor go to great lengths to try to explain that the Peter boats like kind of taper in and narrow, and therefore that's where the word comes from. But I've looked at old pictures of Peter boats from the 19th century, and they don't taper out. They're normal boats. So that was kind of seemed to be really spurious. But the fact that the people who are talking about this like really don't want it to have to do with mines makes me think it really has to do with mines. So I had looked into mining terms and mining treatises and things like that. And I also looked at something interesting. I thought, okay, let's think about this word being borrowed from another language. not being the name Peter, well, which is borrowed from another language, but anyway, you get my point. So, what other languages do we have and I think it's a U.S. term. I think this is a U.S. term. Anybody who says it comes from somewhere else, I don't think that's right, but I think it's a U.S. term. And the reason I think it's a U.S. term is because I think it comes or came from miners who were French speakers in North America, probably in the U.S., could be Canada, who knows, but miners who were French speakers having contact with miners who were English speakers. And where's that going to happen? I think that's going to happen. That's going to happen in places like, for example, there's a place in Missouri where there are lead mines, or used to be lead mines. The alternate name for that town is La Vieille Mine, which is French for the old mine. And that had to do with the fact that there were French settlers there who were miners, and they mined the lead there. And so the situations like that in North America and in what is now the United States, in various places where there are French speakers. So I could imagine this happening in like Maine or New Hampshire or parts of what is now Missouri, maybe in Canadian French-speaking areas, in Quebec or things like that, or on border areas, or this is where this is. I've convinced myself that this is where this comes from. And just to get it out there, there are already people who speculate that the word peter out comes from French, but they either link it to the word salpêtre, saltpeter, or they link it to the word pete, which has to do with flatulence. I have absolutely no idea. I mean, just it's spelled the same. I mean, Peter. That's about all it has in common with that. But so neither of those French terms, I think, have anything to do with this. What I think is going on here is, well, what I did is I translated peter out into French. And the verb that is most commonly translated as peter out in French is tarir, which is, to peter out. And I thought, what are some synonyms in a mining context? And I looked up some old mining books in French and so forth, where we talk about this concept and what's a word that actually is close to Peter. And what I found is that a synonym of tarir is se perdre. So to give out, basically, to run out. So that's my thought for where this comes from. It comes from the French verb perdre, which means to lose, and can be a synonym for to the tarir, which is to peter out in French. And so I have a feeling that that is the mine where we need to find the etymological gold for the peter out. So it's probably, here's my guess, is that I'll call it corruption of the French verb perdre, to, se perdre, to peter out. And was used by French-speaking miners to talk about what's going on. And then you could see how that happens. The English speakers hear it, or there's a French dialectical variant in North America where it starts to sound a little bit closer to Peter and less like perdre. So there you have it. That is my best try at where peter out comes from. And so that we don't just peter out here, let's now ask the cards to draw something up from their mine of knowledge about work and life. And so here we go. Yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles. Cards, tell us some things. All right, here we go. Nope, it's card 22. Some small action you did ended up being big. Oh, this is kind of like the opposite of petering out. Often what seems like a small thing becomes a big thing, and what seems like a big thing ends up being inconsequential. Wow, I can't tell you how impressed I am, cards. This is really a great card for the petering out concept. So tell the story. Start with something you consider absolutely trivial that resulted in you encountering a person or an opportunity that led to something big, or do the opposite. Say something that you thought was going to be really big, but it ended up petering out. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time on Life's Potluck Buffet.